Chapter 1. The Unexpected Question. Ted Johnson never imagined that a routine medical checkup could shatter his entire life. He walked down the sterile hallway of the clinic feeling a slight unease. This year, his usual doctor, Dr. Clark, had retired, and Ted found himself in the hands of a new physician. Entering the examination room, he was greeted by a young woman in her 30s with a confident demeanor and a keen gaze. Dr. Sarah Wilson was unexpectedly attractive, which caused a slight discomfort in Ted that he quickly tried to suppress. "Hello, Mr. Johnson," she greeted him warmly, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Sarah Wilson, filling in for Dr. Clark. I hope you'll find it just as comfortable working with me as you did with him." Ted returned her smile with a slight one of his own and sat down in the chair across from her desk. He wasn't sure what to expect from this checkup. Maybe it would be just like always, a few questions, a quick examination, some tests, and then he'd be on his way. But something in her gaze made him feel uneasy. The examination began as usual. Questions about his health, habits, and any complaints he might have. Nothing out of the ordinary. Ted began to relax, thinking his earlier anxiety was unfounded. But as the examination was drawing to a close, Sarah suddenly paused. Her brows slightly furrowed as she looked at her computer screen. "Ted, I'm sorry to ask such a personal question," she began cautiously, choosing her words carefully. "You have 3 children, correct? And you haven't adopted any of them?" Ted raised his eyebrows in surprise, feeling a cold chill run down his spine. "Yes, 3. But why do you ask?" he inquired, trying to hide his growing concern. Dr. Wilson looked at him, her face showing a hint of uncertainty, as if she was deciding whether or not to continue. "The thing is, I noticed something unusual in your medical records," she said, avoiding direct eye contact. "They indicate that you were diagnosed with congenital infertility." Ted felt his heart skip a beat. Those words echoed in his mind, slowly tearing apart everything he thought he knew about his life. "Infertility?" he repeated, not believing what he had just heard. "There must be some mistake. I have 3 children." Sarah frowned, her expression filled with confusion. "I understand," she said softly. "But this discrepancy can't be ignored. You might want to conduct further tests and review your medical records. There could be an error, but I felt obligated to bring this to your attention." Ted was stunned. He nodded mechanically, but his thoughts were far away. How could this be possible? His children, Brad, Mary, and William, couldn't not be his. He had raised them from birth, watched them take their first steps, heard their first words. They had always been his pride, his purpose in life. I'd like to get copies of my medical records," he finally managed to say, struggling to return to reality. Dr. Wilson nodded and quickly printed out the necessary documents. She handed them to Ted with a polite but cautious expression. "Please, don't take this too hard until you know more," she said, as he was about to leave. But Ted wasn't really hearing her anymore. In his mind, one thought was spinning. Something is wrong, terribly wrong. Holding the records in his hands, he felt as though reality was beginning to crack, leaving behind only fragments of the certainty he once had. When he left the clinic, the air outside felt heavy and oppressive. He slowly walked to his car, his mind racing with all the possible explanations. But none of them could quell the anxiety that had taken root in his heart. Sitting in his car, Ted stayed there for a long time, staring blankly ahead. He knew that now he had to find out the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. And that truth might change everything he thought he knew about his life. This first chapter establishes the key characters and sets the tone for the story, introducing the central conflict that will drive the plot forward. It creates intrigue and sets up the emotional journey that Ted will have to embark on, making the reader eager to discover what happens next. Chapter 2. Awakening Doubts. Ted drove home, but the usual comfort of his familiar surroundings offered no solace this time. The spacious living room, usually filled with the laughter of his children, felt eerily quiet. He hung his coat on the hook and made his way to the kitchen where Catherine, his wife, was preparing dinner. The aroma of roasted meat and fresh vegetables filled the room, but instead of the usual sense of satisfaction and contentment, Ted felt only a growing unease. "Hi, honey." Catherine greeted him with a smile as she turned to face him. "How was your day?" "Hi," he replied, trying not to reveal his anxiety. "It was fine. Just had some errands to run, and I stopped by the clinic for my checkup." Catherine nodded and turned back to her cooking, her focus on the cutting board. But Ted couldn't let the conversation continue as if nothing had happened. He felt compelled to ask, to understand, but how? The questions burned inside him, but he didn't know where to begin. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed to be true, was now in doubt. "Are you okay?" Catherine suddenly asked, noticing his hesitation. Ted snapped out of his thoughts and forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "Yeah, just a little tired." She looked at him closely, trying to read his expression, but finding no answers, she simply nodded and continued cooking. Ted realized that now wasn't the time to bring it up. He needed more information before he could confront her. He headed to his study, closed the door behind him, and sat at his desk. The printed medical records he had received from the clinic lay before him. Each sheet felt as heavy as lead. He began to scan through them, line by line, searching for something that could explain what Dr. Wilson had told him, but instead of clarity, he found only more questions. The diagnosis had been made years ago, congenital infertility, a condition he had unknowingly lived with his entire life. But how could this be? He was the father of 3 children. He remembered when Catherine had first told him she was pregnant, how they had chosen names together, prepared the nursery. All of it seemed so real. But now, it felt like a lie, a dream ready to turn into a nightmare. Ted grabbed his phone and dialed the number of his old friend, Michael Davis. Michael was a urologist, and if anyone could shed light on this situation, it was him. "Hey, Ted, good to hear from you. What's going on?" Michael's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "Michael, I'm in shock. The clinic told me today that I have congenital infertility, but I have 3 kids. How is that possible?" There was a pause on the other end, and Ted felt his heart freeze in anticipation of the response. "Ted, that's a very serious diagnosis," Michael finally said, his voice tense. "If you truly have congenital infertility, then I'm afraid it means you can't be the biological father of your children." Ted felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He didn't want to believe what he was hearing. It all seemed like a nightmare, something he would wake up from any moment. "But that's impossible," he protested, panic creeping into his voice. "I've raised them since birth. They're my kids, Michael." "I understand, Ted," Michael replied softly, "but medicine doesn't lie. You might want to consider doing a paternity test to find out the truth." Michael's words echoed in his mind. Paternity tests. Ted had never imagined he would have to go down that path. He tried to picture himself collecting those samples, sending them off to the lab, and then waiting with dread for the results. But what else could he do? If this was true, then everything he knew about his family was a lie. "Thanks, Michael," Ted said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll think about it." "Ted, hang in there," Michael replied. "This is tough, but you'll get through it. Call me anytime if you need to talk." After hanging up, Ted sat in his study, lost in thought. He replayed in his mind all the moments that now seemed suspicious. Why had Catherine never mentioned any issues with his health? Why had she never suggested they undergo testing together? Everything that once seemed insignificant now took on a new frightening meaning. Night had fallen, but Ted couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Catherine, listening to her steady breathing, and tried to summon the strength to make a decision. He knew the truth could destroy him, but the lies had already done that. When dawn began to break through the curtains, Ted knew what he had to do. He would gather the evidence and find out the truth no matter how painful it might be. Because without the truth, there was no point in continuing. This chapter delves deeper into Ted's internal conflict, showing his first steps toward uncovering the truth. The tension builds as Ted begins to piece together the reality of his situation, setting the stage for the difficult decisions and discoveries that lie ahead. The reader is drawn further into Ted's emotional turmoil, eager to see where his search for the truth will lead. Chapter 3: Secret Investigations. A week had passed since Ted discovered the unsettling truth about his diagnosis, but the anxiety gnawing at him only grew stronger. Each day spent in the company of his family felt like a charade. He observed Catherine and the children with new, distrustful eyes, searching for any signs that might confirm his worst fears. But nothing in their behavior seemed unusual. Everything appeared as it always had, and that scared him even more. One morning, when Catherine had gone to work and the kids were at school, Ted decided to take action. He had hesitated for days, but the realization that he needed to uncover the truth in order to move forward pushed him to act. He drove to the nearest pharmacy where he bought DNA testing kits. When he returned home, his hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was necessary. Ted started with his youngest son, William. It was easiest to collect William's belongings. His toothbrush, comb, clothing, all of it was within easy reach. He gathered several hair samples, carefully sealed them in the provided envelopes, and set them aside. Next, he collected samples from Brad and Mary, trying to be as discreet as possible. The entire process reminded him of a spy movie, and this only added to the weight pressing on his heart. When all the samples were collected, Ted sat down in the kitchen, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He stared at the sealed envelopes in front of him. These small paper packets could change his life forever. But he knew there was no other way. He couldn't continue living in uncertainty. Summoning his courage, Ted headed to the post office and mailed the envelopes to the laboratory for analysis. Now, all he could do was wait. The days leading up to the results were agonizingly slow. Each day spent waiting felt like a torment. He tried to maintain a sense of normalcy around Catherine and the children, but it became increasingly difficult. Nights were the worst. He would toss and turn in bed, unable to sleep. His thoughts twisted and turned in his mind, the same questions repeating over and over. What if? And how will I survive this? One evening, a few days after sending off the samples, Ted was sitting in his workshop trying to distract himself with work. He had always found solace in crafting furniture by hand. It helped him focus and forget about his problems. But today, not even his favorite hobby could quiet his mind. He couldn't think of anything else. Suddenly his phone rang, startling him. He wiped the sawdust from his hands and answered. It was the lab calling. The voice on the other end informed him that the test results were ready and could be picked up. Ted felt his heart stop. He thanked the caller and hung up, sitting frozen for a few moments as he tried to process what this meant. This was the moment of truth, and he wasn't ready for it. He left the workshop and got into his car, driven by instinct alone. The drive to the lab passed in a blur. Ted mechanically guided the car, hardly aware of his surroundings. One thought echoed in his mind. What will I see in those results? The lab greeted him with the quiet hum of working equipment and sterile corridors. The receptionist handed him a sealed envelope, and Ted, after thanking her, walked back out to his car. He didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, he sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, and stared at the envelope lying on the passenger seat. He didn't know how much time had passed before he finally gathered the courage to open it. His hands trembled as he carefully tore open the envelope. Slowly, cautiously, as if each second could change the outcome, he pulled out the results and began to read. The words on the page seemed to leap out at him, striking him in the face. William was not his son. Brad was not his son. Mary was not his daughter. Every line, every analysis confirmed the same devastating truth. Ted was not the biological father of his children. Ted's world collapsed in that instant. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't comprehend how this could be possible. His children, whom he had raised, whom he had loved with all his heart, were not his. He felt everything around him fade away, as if he were in a vacuum, with sounds muted and images blurred. Sitting in his car, Ted felt like the loneliest man in the world. All his fears, all his suspicions had been confirmed. And now that the truth was revealed, he didn't know what to do next. Slowly, as if trying not to break completely, Ted placed the results back in the envelope and took hold of the steering wheel. He drove home, not knowing how he would continue to live with this knowledge. But one thing he knew for certain, his life would never be the same again. This chapter focuses on Ted's actions and emotional turmoil as he decides to conduct DNA tests. It's a crucial step in his journey to uncover the truth, building tension and preparing the ground for the devastating revelations to come. The reader, alongside Ted, experiences the dread, anxiety, and eventual heartbreak of discovering the painful reality. Chapter 4: Results and Revelations. Returning home after receiving the DNA test results felt like a nightmare for Ted. He drove slowly, barely noticing the traffic signs and lights, as if a thick fog surrounded him. In his head, a constant hum echoed, his thoughts racing like confused birds unable to find a place to rest. When he finally parked the car outside his house, he lacked the energy or desire to get out. Ted sat there, gripping the steering wheel as if that gesture could anchor him to the reality that had just crashed down on him. His world, which once seemed so stable and secure, had crumbled in an instant. The questions he had avoided asking himself now demanded answers. How long has this been going on? Why did Catherine keep this from me? Who is the real father of my children? He knew these questions couldn't go unanswered. He couldn't just sit by and let this lie consume him from the inside out. He needed to confront James, to look him in the eye and force him to admit the truth. Gathering his strength, Ted finally stepped out of the car and walked towards the house. His legs felt shaky and it was hard to breathe. As he entered, he immediately heard the voices of his children coming from the living room. Their laughter and carefree conversation seemed distant and unreal to him, like an echo from a life that no longer belonged to him. He walked past them, avoiding eye contact, and headed straight for his study. Closing the door behind him, Ted sat at his desk and pulled out the test results once more. He read those damn lines over and over, as if hoping to find some error. But there was no mistake. The results were clear. None of his children were his biological offspring. At that moment, the door to the study creaked open, and Catherine peeked inside. Her face was relaxed and calm, unaware of the storm brewing within her husband. "Ted, you're home?" she asked with a smile. "The kids are waiting for you for dinner." Ted felt something snap inside him. Her calmness, her casual demeanor, her care. It all seemed like a charade, a lie. How could she have hidden something so important from him? How could she have lived with him under the same roof all these years, knowing that the children he loved so much weren't his? "Catherine," Ted's voice was low and strained, "we need to talk." She noticed his tone and immediately grew cautious, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to remain composed. Ted looked at her, trying to suppress the emotions that threatened to explode. He handed her the test results, and Catherine froze as she took the papers from him. She quickly scanned the lines, and her expression began to change. First, her face paled, then flushed as the realization of what she was holding dawned on her. "Ted," she began, her voice trembling more now. This isn't what you think." He stood up from the desk, feeling the anger boiling inside him. "Then explain to me what it is," he said, barely keeping his voice steady. "Explain to me how this happened. Explain to me why the 3 children I believed were mine aren't." Catherine began to shake, her eyes filling with tears. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. "Ted, She started again, but he cut her off. "Did you cheat on me, Catherine?" His voice was filled with bitterness and pain. "Tell me the truth, because I can't handle any more lies." She nodded, tears now streaming down her face. It was the confession Ted had feared but had already expected. "With who?" he demanded, though deep down he already knew the answer. Catherine lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "James," she whispered. It was James. The name of his brother, spoken aloud, pierced Ted like a knife. He felt his world shatter completely. James, his older brother, the man he had trusted implicitly, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Ted felt a wave of rage wash over him, blinding everything else around him. "How long has this been going on?" he hissed, barely holding himself together. Catherine tried to step closer, but he backed away, unwilling to let her near. "Since the beginning," she admitted, her voice filled with guilt and sorrow. "It started before you and I were married. We've always been drawn to each other, but then you married me, and I stepped back. But when I found out you couldn't have children, I didn't know what to do. James was there, he's always been there. And I was desperate. I didn't want to lose you, Ted." These words felt like a death sentence. Ted felt his life breaking apart. Everything he had believed in, everything he had built was now a lie. His family, his children, his brother, it all seemed foreign, distant, as if it had happened to someone else. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice hollow and weary. "I was afraid of losing you." Catherine dropped to her knees in front of him, pleading for his forgiveness. "I loved you, Ted. I always have. But I couldn't live without children. And James, he helped me. But I never wanted it to go this far." Ted looked down at her, feeling a surge of disgust and betrayal. The woman he had loved, whom he had considered his partner, had deceived him in the worst way possible. And now she was standing there, asking for forgiveness he could not give. "Leave," he said quietly but firmly. Catherine looked up at him, disbelief in her eyes. "Ted, please." "Leave." His voice cracked and he felt the tears welling up in his eyes. Shaking, Catherine slowly stood up and, without saying another word, left the study. When the door closed behind her, Ted collapsed into his chair, feeling his strength drain away. He couldn't hold it in any longer. The tears he had been holding back finally broke free, and he cried like he never had before. The world he had built over the years had crumbled in a single moment. And now, left alone with this awful truth, Ted realized that nothing would ever be the same. The people he had loved had betrayed him, and now he would have to live with this pain, unsure if he would ever be able to forgive or find peace. This chapter delves deeper into the consequences of the revealed truth, focusing on the emotional confrontation between Ted and Catherine. The reader sees Ted face the most painful reality, betrayal by those closest to him. This chapter marks a crucial turning point in the story, significantly intensifying the drama and setting the stage for further conflict. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. Several days had passed since Ted learned the truth. The days blurred together in a haze of anger, pain, and despair. He barely left his study, lost in thoughts and memories, trying to figure out what to do next. Catherine had been avoiding him, spending more time with the kids, trying to keep them from noticing anything was wrong. But the children seemed to sense that something serious had happened between their parents. There was less laughter, less noise, and the house felt heavy with unspoken tension. Ted knew that he couldn't go on like this. He couldn't just sit and let this betrayal consume him. He needed to confront James, to look him in the eye and make him acknowledge the truth. Taking a deep breath, Ted picked up the phone and called his brother. James answered almost immediately, his voice as calm and steady as always, but Ted could detect a hint of unease. "Hey Ted, how's it going?" James asked, as if nothing had happened. "We need to talk." Ted's voice was cold and resolute. "Sure, no problem. When and where?" James responded, his tone tightening slightly. "Tonight, at my place." Ted didn't give him a choice and hung up before he could respond. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anticipation and dread. Ted didn't know how this meeting would go, but he knew it was inevitable. He tried to keep calm around the kids, but inside a storm was raging. He thought about how close he and James had always been, how much he had trusted him, how James had always been there for him in tough times. And now, this man had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. When evening came, Ted felt the tension building. The kids and Catherine were upstairs when he heard a knock at the door. James had arrived. Ted opened the door to see his brother, the man who had shared his joys and sorrows throughout his life. But now, Ted saw a traitor standing before him. "Hey, Ted," James said, stepping inside. "You look tired. Everything okay?" Ted silently gestured toward the living room, inviting James to sit down. They sat facing each other, and for a moment Ted just stared at him, trying to find the right words. "I know everything," Ted finally said, staring directly into his brother's eyes. James froze, a tense smile still on his face, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "What are you talking about?" James asked, trying to maintain his composure. "About you and Catherine," Ted said, his words striking like blows. "About how you slept with my wife, about how you're the father of my children." James turned pale. He dropped his head, as if acknowledging his defeat. For a few moments, the room was filled with silence, broken only by Ted's heavy breathing. "Ted," James began, but his voice cracked and he fell silent. "Why?" Ted interrupted, barely containing his anger. "Why did you do this to me? You were my brother." James buried his face in his hands, unable to look at Ted. He sat hunched over like a beaten dog, and Ted almost felt sorry for him, almost. "I don't know how it happened," James finally said, his voice filled with despair. "Catherine and I were together before you met her. We were always drawn to each other, but then you married her and I stepped aside. But when she found out you couldn't have kids, she came to me. She was desperate and I couldn't say no. I know it doesn't excuse anything, but I loved her. I guess I always will." Ted clenched his fists, his heart aching with pain. All these years he had lived in ignorance, not realizing that betrayal was festering around him. He couldn't forgive either James or Catherine for what they had done. "You've ruined my life, James," Ted said quietly, but his voice was filled with the bitterness of accumulated rage. "And now I want you out of it for good." James looked up, his eyes filled with tears. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew it was over. Slowly, as if under the weight of an invisible burden, he got up and walked toward the door. Ted watched him leave, feeling as if his heart was being ripped to pieces. This wasn't just a break with his brother, it was the end of his old life. When the door closed behind James, Ted remained standing in the living room, surrounded by a ringing silence. He realized that this confrontation had been the final blow, shattering everything he once knew and loved. But despite the pain, he felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and now, however difficult it might be, he could start to rebuild his life. A life without James, without Catherine, but with a new understanding of himself and his strength. When Ted returned to his study, he glanced at the photographs of his children on his desk. He knew that, despite everything, they would remain his children. He would continue to love them as he always had. But now, he would love them differently, knowing that they weren't bound to him by blood, but by something deeper. The years of care, the memories, and the fact that they were and would always be part of his life, despite everything that had happened. Ted sat down at his desk, feeling the exhaustion wash over him. But now, it was a different kind of exhaustion. The kind that follows a long battle, but with a slight glimmer of hope for the future. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but now he was ready for them. Ready to protect his children, his new life, even if it meant going through hell. This chapter immerses the reader in the tense and emotionally charged confrontation between Ted and his brother James. The true motives and reasons behind the betrayal are revealed, laying the groundwork for Ted's future actions. Despite the overwhelming pain and anger, Ted begins to find some closure, setting the stage for the rebuilding of his life. Chapter 6. Aftermath. Ted awoke at dawn, though he could hardly call what he had done sleeping. A glance at the clock told him he had barely rested for a couple of hours, but he couldn't stay in bed any longer. The exhaustion that had plagued him for weeks had lifted, replaced by a grim resolve. He knew what he had to do. The events of the past days had solidified his determination. It was time to sever all ties with the past, no matter how painful that might be. His first order of business was to leave the bedroom, where Catherine still lay in a deep sleep, the only escape from the reality she had created. Ted quietly descended the stairs to the kitchen, where he brewed himself a strong cup of coffee. He knew he would need every ounce of strength he could muster. With the coffee in hand, Ted returned to his study. Here, surrounded by the familiar objects that had once brought him comfort, he began to plan his next move. It wasn't just about ending his relationship with Catherine and cutting off James. It was about protecting his children. Despite the fact that they weren't his biological offspring, he still felt a deep responsibility for them. They were his family, and he owed it to them to make things right. Ted picked up the phone and called his lawyer, Andrew Parker. Andrew had been a trusted advisor handling various legal matters for Ted over the years. Ted knew he could rely on him now. "Andrew, it's Ted," he said when the lawyer answered. "We need to meet as soon as possible. I'm filing for divorce." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and Ted could sense the respect and understanding in Andrew's voice. "Of course, Ted. Can you come in right now? I've just cleared my schedule." "I'll be there in half an hour," Ted replied, feeling his resolve harden. After ending the call, Ted headed upstairs to get dressed. As he passed by the bedroom, he noticed that Catherine was awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, hugging herself, her eyes red and tired. She looked as though she might start crying again, but she didn't say anything as Ted entered the room. "I'm going to see the lawyer," Ted said curtly as he buttoned his shirt. "Ted, please," she began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't, Catherine." His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "I've made up my mind. We're getting divorced. You need to move out within the week." "That's all I have to say?" She sat there, her face twisted in pain, but Ted couldn't afford to feel pity. He gathered his things and left the house without looking back. The drive to Andrew's office was short, but it felt like an eternity. Ted's mind raced with thoughts of how much his life had changed in just a few days. But when he finally stepped into the lawyer's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Andrew welcomed him with understanding, listened to his story without interrupting, and then got down to discussing the details. The divorce would be complicated, but Ted was ready. He was determined to do everything in his power to protect his interests and secure a future for his children. "Ted, I'll handle this case with the utmost care," Andrew assured him. "We'll start the process immediately. But you have to be prepared. Divorces like this can get messy." "I understand." Ted nodded. "But I don't have a choice." After the meeting with his lawyer, Ted felt the weight of exhaustion settle back on his shoulders. He decided to return home, but there was one more thing he needed to do first. He drove to the real estate agency where James worked. The confrontation in his living room hadn't given Ted the closure he needed. He had to see James on his own turf, where he felt in control, and make him face the consequences of his actions. When Ted entered the office, he was greeted by the professional but slightly strained smile of the receptionist. He felt a wave of anger rising but pushed it down. This meeting needed to be cold and businesslike. "I need to see James Johnson," Ted said, and the receptionist nodded, directing him to his brother's office. James looked up as Ted walked in. Surprise and a touch of apprehension crossed his face. He clearly hadn't expected to see Ted so soon after their last encounter. "Ted, what are you doing here?" James asked, trying to mask his nervousness with his usual easygoing demeanor. Ted closed the door behind him and stepped toward his brother's desk. He looked at James as he had never looked at him before. The brother he had loved and respected all his life was now a stranger. "I want you to know that I'm filing for divorce," Ted began, his voice cold and firm. "And I'm going to make sure you pay for everything, for every child you helped conceive, for every lie you fed me. You destroyed my life, and I won't let you walk away unscathed." James seemed at a loss for words. He stared at Ted, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. "Ted, James began, but Ted cut him off again. "I don't need your apologies, James," Ted said, rising to leave. "I need justice, and I'll do whatever it takes to get it." With that, Ted turned and left the office, leaving James sitting there stunned and afraid. Ted didn't want to see his brother, didn't want to hear his voice again. To him, that man was dead. And now Ted had to rebuild his life from the ruins left behind by the betrayal. As Ted drove back home, a strange calm began to settle within him. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but now he was ready to face them. He was ready to protect his children, to build a new life, even if it meant going through hell. When he walked through the door of his home, the silence greeted him. Catherine and the children seemed to have gone about their day, and for that Ted was grateful. He went up to his room, removed his jacket, and sat down on the bed. He knew the future would not be easy, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready to fight for what mattered most, and this fight was just beginning. This chapter focuses on Ted's actions after he decides to file for divorce. It demonstrates his determination not only to sever ties with the past, but also to seek justice, regardless of the difficulties ahead. Ted is now beginning a new chapter in his life, marked by resolve and a newfound inner peace, making him a stronger character ready for the challenges that lie ahead. Chapter 7. A New Beginning. Several months had passed since Ted filed for divorce. Time seemed to move with a painful slowness, leaving behind barely noticeable scars on his soul. Yet, life continued its relentless march forward. Catherine had packed her things and left, abandoning a house that now felt too big and too empty. The children stayed with Ted, but each of them seemed lost in their own thoughts and emotions. They didn't know the full truth, but they sensed that something had fundamentally changed between their parents. Ted made a conscious decision to move forward with his life, despite everything. He began searching for ways to distract himself from the pain and emptiness that had settled inside him. The first step towards this new life was to return to old hobbies that had once brought him joy. One of those hobbies was exercise. Ted had always enjoyed physical activity, particularly running. Before his life had started to unravel, his morning runs had been a way to clear his mind and prepare for the day ahead. Now he decided to return to this routine, hoping it would help him find some peace in movement. That first day on the treadmill was tough. His body had grown unaccustomed to the strain, but despite the difficulty, Ted could feel his thoughts beginning to clear with every step. The fresh air around him, the morning light filtering through the trees, it all gave him a sense that life, despite everything, was moving on. He focused on the rhythm of his breathing and the movement of his legs, leaving behind his fears and doubts. On the third day of his morning runs, Ted noticed he was no longer alone on the treadmill. At about the same time he started his run, a woman of about his age began running on the adjacent treadmill. She was fit, with short cropped hair, and she moved with a confidence and grace that suggested running was more than just exercise for her. It was a way of life. They exchanged brief glances, but no words were spoken. Ted noted her presence, but didn't think much of it. He was focused on himself and his own thoughts. However, over the next few days, the woman continued to show up at the same time, and their silent greetings became something of a ritual. A week later, as they both finished their runs, the woman spoke for the first time. "You run here often, don't you?" she asked, as they both paused to catch their breath. Ted, wiping sweat from his face, nodded. "Yeah, trying to get back in shape," he replied with a slight smile. "I get it. I'm Rachel," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "Ted," he responded, shaking her hand. Rachel's gaze was friendly and open, and it unexpectedly warmed him. They began to talk. It turned out that Rachel, like Ted, was also going through a difficult time in her life. She had recently divorced, and running had become a way for her to cope with the stress and start a new chapter. They exchanged a few words about how hard it was to make such decisions, but how important it was to keep moving forward. After that encounter, their interactions became more lively. They started meeting on the treadmill every day, gradually becoming friends. Their conversations shifted from running to books, movies, and everyday life. Ted felt that he had found in Rachel not just a companion, but someone who understood his pain and supported him through this difficult period. One morning, as they were finishing their run, Rachel unexpectedly suggested, "You know, Ted, I've always wanted to try rock climbing, but I never had the courage to go for it. How about we give it a shot together? It's a good way to take our minds off things and challenge ourselves." Ted thought about it. Rock climbing had always seemed daunting and intimidating, but there was something appealing about it too. He knew he needed to step out of his comfort zone and try something new if he truly wanted to start fresh. "Why not?" he finally replied, smiling. "Let's do it." And so began their new tradition. Ted and Rachel started rock climbing together. The first few sessions were filled with challenges, but that was part of the thrill. Each obstacle they overcame, each summit they reached, gave them both a sense of accomplishment. They supported each other, helping to conquer fears and push through setbacks. Over time, their relationship began to grow beyond friendship. Rachel became an important part of Ted's life, someone who had been there when he needed it most. She helped him open up to new experiences and face the future without fear. They both knew that their bond had been forged through shared pain, but now that pain was giving way to something new and hopeful. Ted realized that with Rachel he could start over. Her support and understanding helped him not only to overcome the past, but also to see that the future held more than just memories of a shattered life. For the first time in a long while, he felt capable of loving again and being loved in return. Gradually, Ted began to build a new life, a life where there was no room for old grudges and regrets. With Rachel, he learned to find joy in every day, to savor the small moments, and to appreciate the things that brought happiness. The road to this new life had been difficult, but now, with someone who understood and supported him by his side, Ted knew he could face whatever came his way. And though the past had left deep scars, he was no longer afraid of them. After all, it was those very scars that had led him to find true happiness. This chapter shows how Ted, despite the pain he has endured, begins to build a new life. It explores his developing relationship with Rachel, who helps him move beyond his past and discover the joys of the future. The chapter is filled with positivity and hope, demonstrating that even after the most challenging trials, happiness is still within reach. Chapter 8. Letting Go of the Past. Several months had passed since Ted and Rachel began building their relationship. During this time, much had changed. Ted finally started to feel at peace with himself. The new relationship, regular exercise, and the realization that he could continue living despite his past wounds had given him strength and confidence. One of the final steps toward a new life was completing the divorce process with Catherine. It had been a long and difficult journey, but it was finally coming to an end. All that remained was the final formality, a meeting with Catherine to sign the final papers. Ted knew that this step was necessary to fully free himself from the past and begin a new chapter in his life. On the day of the meeting, Ted felt a mix of emotions. He arrived at the law firm a bit early, wanting to prepare himself for the conversation with Catherine. He needed to find the strength to not only sign the documents, but also to say goodbye to the memories and feelings that had once connected him to her. Despite all the betrayal and pain, he knew that there had been a time when they had loved each other and built a life together. Catherine arrived shortly after him. She looked tired and tense, but she held herself with dignity. Ted knew that this day wasn't easy for her either. They exchanged brief glances but didn't say a word as the lawyers prepared the documents. When all the paperwork was ready, they were asked to sign. Ted picked up the pen, glanced at Catherine, and hesitated for a moment before signing his part. This was the final act of ending their marriage, and while he knew it was the right thing to do, a part of him still felt a twinge of regret for how their life together had unraveled. Catherine also signed the papers, and for a moment, A heavy silence hung between them. As the lawyers began to gather the documents, Ted spoke unexpectedly. "Catherine," he began, carefully choosing his words, "I want to thank you for everything we had. Despite how it ended, I can't forget that we had good times." Catherine looked up, surprised and perhaps relieved by his words. "I wanted to thank you too, Ted," she replied softly. "I'm sorry for how things turned out and for the pain I caused you. But I'm grateful for what we had. I'll never forget that you were a good husband and father." Ted nodded, accepting her words. He realized that this was necessary to let go of the past and forgive, even if full forgiveness was still out of reach. "We're both moving on," he said, "and that's the right thing to do. We have our children, and we need to do everything to make sure they know that despite everything, we both love them." Catherine agreed, and that moment became the culmination of their separation. Now, they could both move forward, each on their own path, with the understanding that they had once meant a great deal to each other, but that it was time to say goodbye. After all the formalities were completed, Ted and Catherine said their final goodbyes outside the law firm. This time their farewell was more conscious and respectful. Catherine left, and Ted stood on the sidewalk, watching her go. He felt the weight of the burden he had been carrying for months finally begin to lift. Ted returned home, where Rachel was waiting for him. She greeted him with a warm embrace, and in her arms he felt the warmth and support he had so desperately missed in recent years. Together they crossed the threshold of the house that now truly belonged to Ted's new life. "How did it go?" Rachel asked quietly as they settled on the couch. "It went well," Ted replied, holding her close. "We both signed the papers, and it's over now. I feel like I can finally let it all go." Rachel smiled and gently stroked his arm. "This is the start of something new, Ted, and I'm glad I can be a part of it with you." Ted nodded, feeling a new sense of peace blooming in his heart. He knew that ahead of him was a new life, and he was ready to embrace it with Rachel by his side. Saying goodbye to the past was an important step on the road to a new life. Now that all ties had been severed, Ted could finally focus on what truly mattered: his life with Rachel, his relationship with his children, and the future that he had been unable to see through the fog of pain and disappointment. This chapter concludes Ted's emotional journey, showing him finally letting go of the past and completing the divorce with Catherine. It highlights the importance of acceptance and forgiveness, even in the most challenging circumstances. Ted finds peace and confidence in his new life, which he is ready to build alongside Rachel.